The winner to organize the 2022 FIFA World Cup is Qatar.
Smaller than Connecticut, the tiny Gulf state of Qatar is about to host the world's biggest football tournament. But to pull off the most prestigious event in international football, Qatar has opened itself to a deluge of negative headlines.
A collective statement criticising Qatar's human rights record.
There have been concerns about how LGBTQ+ fans will be treated.
And is estimated to have spent up to $300 billion getting ready for kickoff, making it the most expensive World Cup in history.
It's sort of the world's most expensive bet on a football tournament.
So just why has Qatar risked so much to host the 2022 World Cup? The World Cup is an expensive competition to host, but accurate figures on the exact costs of building everything from stadiums to hotels are difficult to come by. Some sources estimate that Brazil spent $15 billion in 2014. Russia spent approximately between $12 billion and $15 billion in 2018, and as of November 2020, it is estimated Qatar has spent as much as $300 billion, making this the most expensive World Cup ever. Qatar hopes the cachet of hosting the competition will help it make its mark on the world stage.
The World Cup, I think, has to be seen in the context of attempts to kind of carve out for Qatar a separate space in the region that kind of gives it a sense of prestige, a sense of influence, and a sense of identity, really, in the face of perhaps some of its more powerful and assertive neighbours.
FIFA estimates 5 billion fans will watch the competition, opening Qatar up to the scrutiny of the world's media.
And reports suggest that more than 6,500 migrant workers from India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh and Sri Lanka have died in Qatar.
We've seen it in terms of questions about how inclusive the tournament will be, questions about environmental sustainability, questions about, of course, migrant labour rights.
27-year-old Shiva Tamang died in a building site accident on April the 19th.
I think a lot of those things have also challenged Qatar to address a lot of the ways that it has conducted its affairs.
To understand why the World Cup matters so much to Qatar, you have to understand its history and its relationship with its Gulf neighbours. With a population of less than 3 million, it began life with an economy based on pearl diving. But the oil boom of the 1950s led to Qatar becoming one of the richest countries in the world per capita.
But oil came to the rescue of many former pearl divers.
The shadows cast by bigger Gulf neighbours and the imposition of British rule until independence in 1971 have made Qatar work hard to establish itself on the world stage.
Qatar had a late start with development and modernization and transforming the country. And it was in a catch-up sort of a mindset. It was surrounded by neighbors who had started decades earlier, had the resources, had the institutions, had the know-how, had the experience.
So much in the Gulf comes down to personalities because these are hereditary monarchies that are often ruled for very long periods of time by the same people and certainly by the same family.
When Qatar switched focus from oil to exploiting its ample natural gas fields, it became one of the largest liquefied natural gas exporters in the world and per capita the wealthiest country in the region. But with the fantastical wealth created by the Gulf's abundance of oil and gas came huge competitiveness.
All of these countries are trying to avoid the curse of being just oil or gas producers and nothing else. Qatar was trying to distinguish itself from the crowd by investing in sectors that were different from the others, but also making political choices that were at times at odds with what neighboring countries wanted or expect or would normally tolerate.
Having phenomenal wealth in a country that has the tiniest of populations means having effectively unlimited resources to spend on all sorts of projects meant to build its prestige around the world.
We've seen a massive investment in things like sports medicine facilities, in museums, in universities, as well as education and culture. And so there was a sense that there was kind of a plan at work.
3, 2, 1, run.
The next part of the master plan was to take on the media. Launching Al Jazeera enabled Qatar to portray itself as a beacon of openness in what many regard as a repressive region.
The CNN of the Arab world.
All of a sudden, there was a pan-Arab network bringing multiple perspectives, showcasing the internal debates within Arab society, and then, of course, bringing coverage of things like the US invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, or the Palestinian Intifada, or, of course, later on, the Arab uprisings that emerged in 2010. And so Qatar being kind of at the forefront of that was in some ways a recognition that it wanted to carve for itself a distinct place in the region that was not like that of its neighbors, for instance, Iran or Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates.
Focusing the spotlight on its neighbours raised tensions. But this was only the beginning of Qatar's ambitions. In 2009, Qatar made its biggest play yet, bidding to hold the World Cup in a country with just one FIFA-regulated stadium and a climate so hot the grass requires its own air conditioning, baffled many.
I think there was a lot of confusion around the world, not only about why this small country had been given it, but whether it would be able to prepare, for the influx of 1 million fans over the course of a month in a country that at the time only had about 2 million people living in it.
But for Qatar, it was an obvious opportunity.
You can think of the bid to host the World Cup and the massive investments made by Qatar in the last decade to organize the tournament as a deliberate exercise in economic diversification. This is a sector that you could invest in possibly, and that will pay off for you into the future.
Since it won the bid to host, the transformation of the country has been colossal. 8 new stadiums, airport and road expansions, hotels, hospitals, and a metro system have all been built to accommodate this huge event.
To see a significant amount of money spent in the organization of a tournament that in the process brings about development, prosperity, progress, and shapes the image of the country in the eyes of the world, I think has been a good bet.
But Qatar's gamble to position itself as a major player almost backfired with its neighbours. When on June 5th, 2017, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt cut all land, air, and sea links to Qatar.
The blockade was a shock to Qataris, and it was a very formative event for so many people living in the country. It was a surprise. They sort of woke up one morning and found that their land border, their only land border with Saudi Arabia, had been closed.
The Gulf states that were blockading Qatar at the time were exhibiting a sense of resentment toward the fact that Qatar had achieved hosting duties for the World Cup. This is symbolic or representative of some of the kind of deeper underlying issues and rivalries that have existed in this region for far longer than we've been talking about the FIFA World Cup.
The blockading nations issued Qatar with a list of 13 demands, including ending its alleged connections with terrorist groups.
All of them had to do with the country's foreign policy and the fact that sort of uniquely among the Gulf states, it did not share the foreign policy of Saudi Arabia and the UAE, the two big heavyweights of the region. And so the most obvious demand was a demand for Qatar to cease its support for groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, for political Islamist groups across the region that have long been opposed to Saudi and the UAE.
The list also demanded Qatar sever ties with Iran, a known antagonist of Saudi Arabia. But with so much of the country's wealth tied up in the gas field it shares with Iran, the state had little choice but to work around the blockade. Qatar formed new trade routes, mainly with Turkey, to redirect its supply chains.
In some ways, a kind of unintended consequence of the blockade was that it actually made the region less integrated, and it made Qatar far more self-sufficient in a way, given the fact that it developed all of these other mechanisms.
On January 5th, 2021, 3.5 years after it started, the blockade abruptly ended, despite Qatar refusing to agree to any of the 13 demands.
When you ask people in the Gulf why they decided to end the blockade when they did last year, you sort of hear different answers. One of them is that some countries in the region came to a recognition that this wasn't working. It exacted a huge diplomatic cost on them as well in the West. There were a lot of countries that were upset about this and wanted the Gulf countries to mend fences. The World Cup was coming up. Everyone else in the Gulf stands to benefit from the World Cup, from fans who might choose to base themselves in places like Dubai, fans who might, after going to matches in Doha, want to be a tourist and go somewhere else in the region. There was an economic benefit to be had, and the Gulf countries didn't want to lose out on that benefit by maintaining the blockade.
Whether the conflict between the Gulf states will resume after the final whistle blows is unclear.
A lot of the underlying issues are still very much present, whether we're talking about kind of other major political disruptions regionally, whether having to do with various other states in the Arab region or the kind of ongoing standoff with Iran. Then, of course, some of these rivalries might continue to kind of play out as they have before.
But the fact that those countries are now piggybacking on the spoils of hosting a World Cup suggests Qatar already achieved some success.
They've acted a bit like a football team with a very wealthy owner who's willing to throw a lot of money at taking a shot on a star player, not knowing exactly how that player is going to work out, but being willing to make that effort. But it's sort of the world's most expensive bet on a football tournament.
If all goes well, the joys of the month-long tournament will help Qatar build its image as a global sporting hub. But the criticisms it has faced, mainly on human rights, aren't going away.
And hopefully, even after the World Cup ends and the world's attention shifts to somewhere else, that we'll not see a kind of backslide from addressing these issues in criticisms.
With the world focusing on the hosts and not just the football, whether its $300 billion gamble will fully pay off remains to be seen.
It's a hard thing to say before the tournament, what sort of legacy it will leave. A lot of this depends on questions like, did they overbuild? All of these highways, all of these hotels, everything that has been built for this World Cup, does it find a use? Maybe it won't next year, but will it find a use 5 years, 10 years hence? Or will this all look like sort of one giant white elephant that maybe gave everyone a good show for a month, but turned out to be tens of billions of dollars of wasted money?
From Qatar's perspective, of course, it has been very much folded into the idea of a kind of a massive national modernization plan, maintaining its ability to not just host this tournament, but going forward, there's been talk of a future Olympic bid. And so there's a sense that Qatar is now known in a way that it certainly wasn't 10 or 12 years ago.
I'm Greg Karlstrom, the Economist Middle East correspondent. To read more of our coverage of the World Cup in Qatar, click the link and don't forget to subscribe.